Tapscott. All right, welcome back. Time to mix it up on some of the headlines this afternoon, including making a federal case out of financial reform, trying to keep junk food out of our schools. Can it be done? And a shocking game show raising all sorts of eyebrows. Would you be willing to electrocute someone you didn't know? I'm suspecting you would say absolutely not, but this test is crazy. We'll get to that. Anyway, we begin with congressional testimony today from Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. Bernanke appeared before Congress today to try to fight back against Senate attempts to strip the Federal Reserve of its authority to supervise smaller banks. He argues that the Fed should keep that power because it helps in setting monetary policy. Meanwhile, he gave some insight into the well-being of the entire banking system.
Central banking is an art, and we need to balance our dual mandate. Our dual mandate is to maximum employment and price stability, and we need to try to find an appropriate policy that gets us as close as we can to both sides of that mandate.
Considering the massive wealth transfer, job loss, and economic collapse, I'm not sure that Mr. Bernanke, in my opinion, is the best artist to be doubling down on. Bernanke's testimony follows the release of a 2,200-page document that links Bernanke and, for that matter, and perhaps more importantly, the Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner to the accounting fraud that caused the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. Geithner, at the time that Lehman was perpetrating the fraud, was the head of the New York Federal Reserve at the time of collapse. He appeared on the Rachel Maddow show last night. Rachel asked him what Geithner wishes he had done differently at the start of the crisis.
We did not do enough. I'm the first to admit it. We were very aggressive in New York. We made a lot of difference in New York, but we could have gone further.
Basically. Here to mix it up, editorial writer for The Washington Post, Jonathan Capehart, and editorial page editor for The Washington Examiner, Mark Tapscott. It's a pleasure to see both of you. What strikes me here, Mark, is the request for more regulatory authority from an agency that clearly has already proven itself more interested in cultivating growth, and it's more of a gardener than a regulator. It's more interested in sort of promoting the growth of the industry than it is in regulating the industry. How do you see the Federal Reserve's relationship with our government right now? Whether
we're going to give the Fed more or less regulatory authority, I think the fundamental problem, particularly this week, which happens to be Sunshine Week, is that we need much more transparency in the Fed. For example, it would be really great to have all of the documents that Congress has requested on the TARP program, but they won't turn those over. Wouldn't that be great? So the fundamental problem here is not how much authority do they have, but what are they doing with the authority they do have.
Right. And why is it so difficult to get information about our money from the people who are the custodians of our money in this town?
Well, that's a very good question, and it seems like the folks in this town, as you point over at the Capitol,
the political industrial complex back there,
that don't seem to have very much of an interest to make that happen. I mean, you've been calling for this for at least a couple of years. Sure. They're not listening to you, Dylan.
Why not? All right. I think they'll listen eventually. But I do want to move on to the food conversation in this country. You call it the MICA law.
Mika's law.
Mika's law. Kraft Foods announcing a 10% cut in the level of salt in its food products over the next 2 years. This following a meeting with the First Lady and our nation's largest food companies yesterday. Pepsi also pledging to remove some of its sweetened drinks, from schools by 2012. Mrs. Obama urging companies to make healthier foods with less salt, sugar, and fat. Take a listen.
That's why we launched Let's Move, a nationwide campaign to rally this country around a single and very ambitious goal to solve the problem of childhood obesity in a generation so that kids born today will reach adulthood at a healthy weight.
Yeah. This is another one that is, I don't know, it's as common sense as transparency at the Fed, and yet there's a lot of tax benefits that go to food companies if you look at the way the subsidies play out. And ironically, the subsidies tend to not be in alignment with the exact same government recommendations for nutrition. Why is that?
Well, that's because we have such a big government, and government has so many ways to control what our businesses do, and what we end up with is partnerships between, frankly, business and the regulators.
How do you address that problem right there?
Well, I mean, that's a problem that, you know, Congress is going to have to deal with and the White House is going to have to try to deal with. But I do think that this administration and the First Lady, they're trying to get at it in the ways that they can without having to depend on Congress. But, you know, using the bully pulpit of the White House to say to Pepsi, you know, I think you should think about pulling the fatty sodas out of the schools. I think you should cut back on salt and other things that are feeding into the obesity problem, but also feeding into other health problems that then feed into other issues like health care, in the insurance.
Healthcare costs, et cetera.
Exactly.
Is shaming adequate in your view?
Well, I was just fixing to say, Jonathan, in Chicago, that's known as the Chicago way, making them an offer they can't refuse. You know, it's great for the First Lady to do this, and I think both of our papers have endorsed it. I would remind viewers that I was just reading South Beach Diet, as you might see why, and I came upon a chapter in which he reminded us that the obesity crisis that we have today is very much a product of the government getting it wrong 20 years ago on what should be a proper diet. So.
And creating tax incentives. I mean, how much of it is a function of things like the corn lobby or things like, I mean, where you have lobbying from businesses that stand to make a small fortune if they can get the beneficial treatment of the government, much like a bank would. The corn lobby and Archer Daniels, Midland, and the rest of them have the same agenda, which is make money by selling corn, whether it's good for people or not. Is that a fair assessment?
That is absolutely fair.
That is absolutely fair. And that's why I think it's important that people within the administration go at ways of curbing that influence with the power that they have. And it might seem small, but having the First Lady say to schools and say to children, you know, there are alternatives to the orange Sunkist that you drink every day, or to the processed meats and things. You know, apples are good. Yeah, arugula is great.
Well, but the funny thing is, and we don't have the pyramid right now, but if you look at the food, the recommended food, like I said, you look at the recommended food pyramid, and it'll have a huge section that says vegetables, fruit, and this sort of thing. And then you look at the tax treatment, and there's no tax benefit for anybody growing vegetables and fruit, but there's tremendous benefit for people that are growing corn. Anyway, we get it. And this is where you think that Congress doesn't work for the people. I go down the list of the stories every day, and it works for people who can use the government to make money, as opposed to the government working for the people to ensure freedom and fairness. Do you think that that the profound election that may be necessary to deliver the message to Congress will come, that they will ultimately become more fearful of the people than they are of the special interest that they get their money from?
If that doesn't happen this November, it's not going to happen. I
don't know about this November, but the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll that came out yesterday should be a wake-up call to the folks on Capitol Hill, because the American people for the first time said they don't like anybody.
Right.
They don't like Congress, but they also don't like their own member of Congress, which is the first time we've ever seen this. They want to throw everyone out and give control either to the Democrats or the Republicans, but just people who are new, who can get things done.
Finally, this reality TV taken perhaps a bit too far. It's a spoof French game show, the subject now of a documentary. Its contestants deliver what they are told are near-lethal electrical shocks to rival contestants. The question is, how often are you willing to deliver these shocks? The answer is 82% of the time.
Laissez-moi partir! Laissez-moi partir!
The shocks were actually fake, and the contestants being zapped were actually actors. But the disturbing experiment is not the first of its kind. In a similar study from the 1960s, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram told subjects that pressing a button would deliver electrical shocks to innocent strangers in the next room. In that test, the button was pressed 2/3 of the time. What does that tell you about human nature?
People are scary. I mean, who takes part in an experiment like that?
I'll tell you how to get to 100%.
How?
Make sure that the people being shocked are all congressmen.
Yeah, exactly. All right. We wouldn't even wish that upon them. Thank you both for the conversation.